So, yes, kick start with the first slide. Just a quick background if you've not heard or really understand what the Wild Trout Trust is about. We're not an angling organisation, but we have to admit we are all anglers. We're a conservation charity, and we're not just focused on the fish, we are actually all about hands-on, in the water projects. So our focus is on habitat and restoration and trying to get it right, and we use trout as a central species, which I'll come to in a moment. So our focus is really on habitat improvement and empowering groups like yourselves, any organisation, an individual landowner, a rivers trust. We're many things to many people. So we give freely of our advice. My role as the research and conservation officer is to sort of meld make sure all of our advice and all of our practical input is underpinned by sound science and communicate the latest science in things like river restoration, trout genetics, all that sort of thing. So we're available for advice and support at any, well, I won't say any time, but you know, most of you, quite a few of you have got my telephone number now, so use it wisely. So yes, you as a club came to me for advice, and I produced the advisory report, which I'm going to be talking to tonight. Just to say, as an ecologist, we use the trout as a sentinel or a totemic species, so it's somewhere in the middle of the food web there, and if there's a good, healthy, sustainable wild population of trout, then that should tell us something about the ecosystem. There's good quality water, there's sufficient water in this day and age. There's obviously good fly life, not only in the water but on the land to support trout, because they're awesome at taking subsidies from the land as well. And obviously, having a good population of trout, we should have a healthy population of predators too. There's nothing wrong with that in a balanced ecosystem. Of course, as anglers, we tend to think about trout like this. It's a nice 3 3/4 pound hen fish from the air, wild fish. But to get fish like that, you obviously have to think about the other life stages. And so when we're thinking about a big fish, like we've just shown you, obviously its wants and needs from the river are very, very different to the eggs and the alevins and the fry and the parr, and eventually some of the sort of juveniles that we may start to actually catch. We've got to be thinking about these guys if we want these guys. And that's where historically perhaps the angling side of things has fallen behind a little bit. So when I come and see a river, so thank you for inviting me to see your river. I never get bored of these things, David. No matter if it's the same river, just a different stretch, it's all absolutely fascinating for me. So anybody recognise that particular bit? That is your water, up around Low Hall, if I'm right, if I can remember it correctly. So we often talk, as WTT conservation officers, we talk about a habitat mosaic. So lots of different things here. There's boulders in the river, there's fast, shallow water, there's slower, deeper water, there's slacker water around the sides, there's nice overhanging trees. And I don't look just at the river here, I look at the river bank as well. That's equally important. I don't know whether Luke will remember my mantra, but if you walk up to a water body and you want to basically know what's going in that water body, turn your back on the water body and look to the land around you, because so much of what goes on in the water is governed by the surrounding landscape. Unfortunately, that habitat mosaic is quite often lacking or compromised in some way. So another stretch of your water down towards the footbridge, just above the footbridge, yeah, which is about here. So a little bit more canalised. You can see it's deep, it's sluggish. Not really what the river nid should be doing. It should look much more like the previous slide. Yes, there are trees, but it suffers from, like many Dales rivers do, from what I call the one tree deep syndrome. So they're all, there's rarely more than one tree deep in terms of distance from the bank, and they're all of a similar age, which imparts some probably issues further down the line. We can see here, this is not natural bank material. these whopping great boulders here have been put here to stop the river moving over time. So we've got some bits and pieces of the river which are lacking in habitat. Obviously there are constraints within a modern landscape, so this is a satellite image of your waters, not all of your waters. Darley down here, Darley Beck coming in here, and here's the Nid with this one tree deep scenario. In fact, the Nid is probably the best example of the Dales rivers for that. If you look at it from satellite, almost anywhere you will see it's completely lined by trees, which is great when you think about it from a climate change perspective. They are all of an age, they're all of the same age, and when they start to fail, which they will, then we've got problems if there's no succession coming along behind them. So the thing that strikes me about this is that these are really long, slow, sweeping bends, not natural at all. What's natural here is Darley Beck going wiggling around across here, whereas the Nid has been sort of curved around here in a gradual bend, and we all know why that is. Well, most of you, I'm sure, will know why that is, because those constraints were put in place in a not so modern landscape. And this is the 1848 survey of the OS map, published in 1853. Nobody in the room that was around then, was there? Just checking, just checking. But you can already see that the railway line is here, or the plans for the railway line. I don't know whether it was complete then, I don't know my local history that well, but the river has been shunted into this position, and if you look closely at this map, there's the demarcations for embankments all the way around here. So you would have expected in the past that the River Nid wandered across this lovely flat floodplain in the past, and even as long ago as 170 years, it was already pinned into position, and it hasn't been able to move since. And there's all sorts of ecological ramifications from that. I'll come back to this point later on. Obviously this is the bottom end of your water here, but effectively the river was shunted right the way across to that side of the floodplain, and then turned fairly viciously and punted back across the valley to make it perpendicular to fit it underneath the railway and to stop it going anywhere else. Obviously it's very difficult to get a river to flow and suddenly kink and then just drift on down the other side of the railway line. It's not going to want to do that. So that was a big engineering feat to get it underneath the railway all the way back then. This is looking at it from a completely different perspective. I'm sorry it's not exactly the same proportions, but you can see Darley Beck wiggling in here. You can see the main channel. This is a LiDAR satellite image digital elevation model generated by my good colleague at the Environment Agency, Chris Nash. And you can see the main river here pinned into position. These really stark edges are the embankments, but if you look closely you can see the ghosts of the river past, where it was wandering about across the landscape. And I'm pretty sure somewhere around here there's a bit of an old oxbow or something like that. I can't quite see from this angle, but that's what the river was doing. And in those days it would have been a much more gradual gradient. We would have seen much more regular sort of pool, riffle, glide scenarios, whereas because it's been straightened in many instances, a straighter river is a steeper river. It doesn't get out of bank as often because of those embankments on both sides. It's not allowed to wiggle because of the boulder and revetment that's been put down the side of it. So as a consequence, the power rushes through it, strips out all the gravel, doesn't retain the leaf litter like it might do in a wiggly system like this. And of course, then when you've straightened it in some areas, like this for example, and ramped it up to the side of the valley, and then turned it around, it's got a bit of head over here, so all of this is sort of a very long, slow, sluggish, impounded section, and then it cascades around the corner, and then it's not allowed to go down the valley. It's punted, perpendicular across the valley, so it's fairly sluggish across there, and then suddenly it's released again. So when you start to look on the ground at these various features, think about it in terms of what the river's been forced to do. It's not what it wants to do, it's what it's been forced to do. So what can we do? Let's think about the, I won't refer page by page to the report, but various things I think that can be done very, very quickly and simply by the club. Just thinking about this one tree deep scenario and whether there's any gaps in any spots along the river, or even where there are mature trees but there are protected pieces of the riverbank, whether you can engage with that particular landowner and perhaps undertake a little bit of tree planting. Trees are very easy to get hold of nowadays. Everybody's saying plant them. The Queen wants loads planted this year for her Jubilee. Woodland Trust, TCV are giving them away to groups like yourselves. I've just taken consignment of 2,950 for my local village woodland group from various sources. So this is to sort of bolster succession on the riverbanks. So when all these mature trees, all of a similar age, when they start to fail, to have something behind them ready to take over from them. And it's always good to have a diversity of ages as well as a diversity of species, because physical diversity begets biological diversity. So this to diversify for diversity, the more different tree species we have there, instead of just alders or willow or something along the riverbank. If we can diversify that out a bit more, then obviously we'll be diversifying the macroinvertebrates, all the little bugs which potentially could end up on the menu for the fish. What else can we do with trees? Well, we can replicate natural woodfall. So surprisingly enough, for the amount of tree cover that you have along the river, there's virtually nothing in the river. This is one of the few examples where a crack willow, its common name, and it does what it says on the tin, they crack and they fall, has fallen. It's cracked in a relatively strange place for a crack willow. They normally go a little bit lower, but I think that was, there was clearly a fault in it. But what they do is they fall over, and on an evolutionary basis, they send out adventitious roots. So wherever the branches or the trunk hits wet ground, they'll start to root again and they'll stay alive. And theoretically, this could crawl down the river if we watched it for long enough. But this is still alive. It's got a whopping great crack in it. I think that wouldn't be particularly healthy, but when I was there, and is it still there?
Yeah.
Who was with me? Ian? Yeah. And it's obviously been there a while, I would say. Anybody like to confirm, refute, shoot me down? Anyway, it's still alive. There's lots of shoots coming off it now vertical, so where it has fallen over, those shoots are now coming off it vertically. This is a thing of beauty to me. It's absolutely fantastic. On the surface, well, within that mass there, you've got refugia for fish from predators and from spate flow. You've got invertebrates using it to get in and out of the water. You've got flow, which is diverted slightly around it, and then when the spates come along and they have to go around it more, you get deposition on the downstream side, you'll get scour on the outside, you'll get feeding lies, things like that. Features like that increase the holding capacity of your water. So instead of just a slow, relatively canalized, sluggish glide, if we can replicate that, and we can do, there are various techniques to do it, then I think that's all well and good. People sometimes wonder it's tough to visualize if you just see that tree on the surface. So I've stuck this next slide in of some work that I've deliberately done. And if you look closely here, this is pre any works. I've chopped this branch here, or trunk here. This is another crack willow. And I've basically there's the stump, and I've dragged it across the river, and I've tied it to a tree up here. That's all I've done. The landowner there was worried about this landslip, rightly so. And by just taking that bit of tree there and putting it over here and tethering it on this bank, I've diverted the majority of the flow around it. But what I've also done is caused all of this deposition. So you can see all of that has built up there effectively, just because I've put this branch here. So that's effectively what's going on underneath the water behind that bit of willow that I showed you just before. But that's, just because there's flat water over the top of it, still means we've got now a shallower bit of water and a deeper bit of water downstream of that willow. And it's that diversity which, the fish, if this was all covered in water, the fish would most likely be sitting along this edge. They like edges. So, really, really simple intervention. Anybody like to guess what the difference in time from those two photographs is?
2 years, 3 years.
2 months. Did that in November last year. That was taken this week. Thank you. James. And the other thing, of course, is to look after the youth. Now, because of the fact that the NID has been straightened, realigned, embanked, there's fewer opportunities for spawning habitat in the main stem channel. That's not to say that it won't occur. There are bits and pieces of spawning habitat that are available, but there's not as many as there should be. If we get more trees in there and more gravel banks building up and things like that, and trying to, in a miniature way, if you like, increase the sinuosity of the river, but within the physical constraints of the embankments, which it's perfectly feasible to do, we can increase the spawning habitat within the main channel. But obviously, we've got Darley Beck as well, which is in reasonable condition. It appears to be fenced, at least along the bottom section of it, and I was trying to get out this January before coming to this meeting to see whether it's fenced all the way to the road. Does anybody know whether it is fenced all the way to the road? Partially. So there is potentially some work there that maybe engage with the landowner. So if we could protect all of it, simple things, just by putting a livestock exclusion fence, we can maximise the spawning habitat potential within the beck. Come back to that in a second. But crucially, we'll be retaining shade, cover, gravel, leaf litter, all that sort of thing in this tiny little system, which, it's not worth going in there and fishing, unless you're really hardcore with a 5-foot rod and like to spend a lot of time on your knees, for example. It'd be good fun, but it's worth working on these little systems even if we aren't directly fishing them, because this is where the youth will come from. And so in terms of in-stream structure, this gentleman might be known to a few of you. This is Peter Chambers of Knaresborough, working on Cockhill Beck in Hampstead. Next slide, please. And you might definitely recognise this chap. This chap's got prior form. So all we're doing on Cockhill Beck is installing some woody deflectors. It's less easy there to use whole trees. There are a few around, but they're all a little bit big for the size of the system. So we basically cut down some trees and with owner's permission and chopped up some logs to the appropriate size, and Brian walloped them in. Yeah. And the purpose of these really is to create these upstream deflectors. So this is a paired deflector. It looks a little bit like a weir at the moment. It shouldn't really, because there's nothing there. That's an open gap. But what we're doing by putting in an upstream V is when the water comes down and overtops them, you can see that basically the water comes off at a perpendicular angle to the log. So the focus of the flow is towards, you've got two opposing streams of flow to the middle of the beck. So that's why this is scoured out here on the downstream side. So on the upstream side, we get gravel accumulating. This is all lovely spawning gravels now on both sides. And then on the downstream side, we get a dip, and then at the bottom end of that pool, we'll also get deposition and retention of gravel. These are the perfect spots for trout to be spawning upon. And just from going from downstream to upstream of you, this is some work that I've been doing at Dalber Gill at WAF with Nidderdale Angling Club. So we can certainly, or I can certainly come back and help you with electrofishing to see what population you do have in Darley Beck. This is the sort of thing we're after, so we're looking for the fairly small trout, even smaller individuals down here. This is the sort of results you can achieve. So these are data from Dalber Gill. We've got 3 years of data here, 2019 in blue, 2020 in orange, 2021 in grey. All I've done here, this is frequency on the y-axis versus sort of trout length here, and I've binned these guys so into 10mm bins, so they're not exact lengths. They are 40mm fish, 50mm fish, 60mm fish, etc., etc. So what we've got here is what we would call the young of year. So those spawned and less than 1 year old, anywhere between 40 and 70mm. These are 1+ fish, so they're in their second year of growth, and these are 2 or 3 year old fish. Okay, from Dalbergill. Dalbergill, if you know it, it's tiny. It's about, for the most part, it's about as wide as that table. This is when we put the interventions into Dalbergill, and we started boosting the trout population almost immediately. But over that 3 year period, we've boosted the young of year production by 227%. So fairly instant results. And they're not all going to hang around in Dalbergill. As you can see, over that 3 year period, the number of older fish actually remains the same. So all those younger fish basically drift down. Not all of them will make it out, obviously, but the idea is that they'll drift downstream and start looking for niches of their own, holding spots of their own in the river. So, I think there's great potential and really easy things that you can do as a club on your fishery. There are various things you can talk about in terms of pressures on the system. I mean, this is a picture here where there is no buffer strip fencing. There's quite a lot of erosion on these banks where the livestock have been coming down. I think sheep on that side, and there's lots of fines coming in. There's all sorts of pressures that are perhaps outside of your control. There are some pressures that are within your control, but to create a sustainable fishery, all things being equal, these are the 3 key things that you can do, and habitat improvement, which is the thing that I can help you with, certainly is one of those. And the way I suggest we do that is the Environment Agency are opening a call for fishery improvement programme funding at the moment. So this is your rod licence money recycled. Okay, a proportion of your rod licence money gets set aside for habitat improvement works, and I can tap into that. There's about 48k for the whole of Yorkshire, which seems like a pathetic amount, but I normally manage to nab about 25% of that for angling clubs. So that's what funded the Knaresborough work, that's what initially funded the Nidderdale work, upstream and downstream of you. Similar sorts of things, focusing. But I've got lots of ideas. I won't talk about the specifics of that, but we probably need to get cracking if you want me to apply for you or to help you apply for that. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, absolutely. Any questions?
Could I just ask, what is the general state of the water in the river? Is there any checking on that? Is there what pollution level is there in the amount of coming down the Nid?
Well, I have not looked at any water quality data per se, but having fished upstream of you for this last season and done a fair amount of kick sampling and looking at the fly life while I've been up there, I would say it's in reasonable quality. Sure there are certain stressors. I noted the sewage treatment works and your reach downstream of the footbridge as being not in particularly good condition. I mean, there's an interaction between the state of the channel and the water quality that comes in as well. So a constrained, a modified channel, like we have more of around here, is less able to cope with poorer water quality. If you tipped the same amount of sewage or whatever it is, slurry coming off the land, whatever it is, into the river upstream at Wath, I think you'd barely notice it. But because of the way the channel has been modified and constrained and things like that, it's less functionally able to deal with that. But comparably speaking, I'd say you're actually better off than many bits of the wharf and the air that I know of.
Could I just when it comes to trout spawning in river,
Yes.
do grayling have a bigger advantage spawning in river than trout? Is it a different thing? Improving it for trout, do you improve it for grayling?
So they certainly use the same sorts of areas, obviously at different times of the year. A lot of the sort of smaller trib work wouldn't be useful for grading in stream in those smaller tribs because there probably wouldn't be the required flow, assuming they can access it.
And is there a link between stocking trout and losing grayling numbers and?
Yes, quite.
Yeah.
Marked.
Picking up on that point, based on what you said, in terms of trout life cycle, fish life cycle, predation, fish predation, or other mammal predation, etc. What does stocking do to your fishery?
What does stocking do to a fishery?
In the instance you just presented, is it a positive thing? Is it negative and harm?
So I would say, why would you think you had to stop the river here in the first instance? I'll turn that around slightly, just to take the pressure off me. But I would say, why would you think you need to stop? The day I was here, there were trout rising all over the place. I haven't fished your waters, but I do fish upstream, and it's not stocked where I fish there. I only fish dry fly. I'm not a prolific fisherman, and I wouldn't say I was a particularly good fisherman, but I do catch a fair amount of fish up there. I think the potential is there. You've got the potential there. There are all sorts of really, really complex issues with stocking. I mean, depending on what size of fish that you put in, it's not just a case of the genetics which has been wiped out by this the diploid thing. Just putting a naive strain of fish into the system is going to cause a stressor for the population that is already there. Especially if you really don't know how many fish are already there, and you're suddenly tipping a load more on top of them. But it's multifaceted. I've just reviewed a paper in the last couple of weeks where a team of Finnish scientists have been looking at mink predation, for example, and they've clearly demonstrated that mink are far more adept at taking stockfish, but the wild population where stocked fish are put in do worse because the mink are there focusing on the stockfish, and when they run out of stockfish, which happens very quickly because the stockfish are relatively naive, the mink are there already, so they'll hammer the wild population. So the wild population suffers because of the stockfish.
I fish a lot on the Ribble, and
Yep.
years ago, 2000-ish, a lot of clubs were die spotting the trout, and it was just sort of proven that all they do is stockies is move downstream. They
Yeah.
keep moving, and they even had mid-Ribble at the bottom, even had stock trout run back as sea trout. They
Yep.
caught a sea trout with a die spot on it, because they're just on the food, so they just keep moving downstream.
Yeah. So that's common story wherever. I mean, I've got data from clubs all over the country for that. The retention, on average, over winter is less than 1%.
You just throw money away.
That would be my opinion. When you've got the potential to generate a good putting it another way, one of the benefits of having a wild population. People say, I've heard it on the wharf, I've heard it on the wire, I've heard it on the air to a certain extent. We've never had trophy fish. Now, I've had people say that to me in a pub in Middleton at Ilkley, stood in a room where there's a £6 trout on the wall from 1923 or something like that. It's like, well, there were, and there is the potential to generate these bigger fish. They were just fished out of existence a long time ago before our baseline has shifted.
I think the Ribbles are a really good example.
Yeah.
Because you now get good numbers of grayling and you get year classes of trout and you get some superb trout.
Yeah.
And the river has moods again. It ain't just a case of pulling out pasties within.
Yeah.
So I'm not,
I think those are the perfect points. It's habitat and what the wild fish can and you will get trophy fish.
So the average size might be smaller, but there'll be more. You might have to pay for it, and actually the size range theoretically will be better. That's the.
And they'll be there.
Sorry.
And they will be there.
Johnny, may I just go on something else?
Sure.
I mean, you're talking about trees falling and then
Yep.
tying trees and all that. And to be absolutely honest, I mean, I agree with all that.
Yep.
But I find it a bit forbidding, we have our work parties, which I mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
and Ian's terrific about this. He just loves that old chainsaw. But it's intimidating.
Sure.
Is it beyond our little capabilities?
No. So I'd argue strongly not. So that is generally it's a common feeling.
Is it?
Yep, absolutely. Because you get me or you get one of my colleagues along and we produce a report and just do this, and this. And it's like, okay. And quite a lot of, many clubs, take Nidderdale as an example, they got a report from us, I think, in 2008, and then they got me to come back out, no, it wasn't 2012 or something like that. And they got me to come out in 2018, and they said, we've got this report, can you really just update us and perhaps prioritise what we should do? And I'm local to you now. I am your local conservation officer, so I'm only in just the other side of Skipton. It's very easy for me to get here, and I have a very good feel for your river, and not only that, but the network. So people like the Woodland Trust, people like the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust, the EA Fisheries guys, the pots of money that can be put towards this thing. So the way to take this forward is for me to come and do a workshop with you and handhold you through it, like I did on Cockhill Beck that you came along to with the Knaresborough guys, and talk you through all of that and make sure that you understand the whole process, because there are things, there are hoops that you have to jump through from a flood risk perspective. But all of those sorts of things are entirely to my benefit of your size. I would say.
That's encouraging.
So, sorry, go on then.
Can I just go back to water quality?
Yes.
You've got some lovely suggestions this evening.
Yes.
Gagging for it, I think, in many ways.
Right.
But in terms of water quality,
Yes.
if you were putting the priorities in terms of getting a healthy environment to support our local wild fish, where would water quality come into this activity,
So,
both the agricultural and the sewage?
so it's one of the, we call it the tripod. So it's one of the legs of the tripod. It's incredibly important, honestly. I'm approaching it more in practical things that you as a club can do, but I think in the report I said, the more you can engage with Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust, lend your voice. You've already started with iWolf. I have to say I think I was fairly instrumental in getting the NID catchment group up and running, because 4 clubs came to me independently and said, Hellfire, we've seen what's come out of Galway, and I said, this is what you need to do, but if you do it together, this will be great. You're going to get more. And there's still this perception that anglers only want to go to the river and catch fish and take them away. Some people do, but most fly anglers now are so conservation minded. so conservation minded, and that just drives me around the twist. I heard from somebody in the Environment Agency in the Northwest region who said, "Oh, you're the first angler that I've heard of that is wanting to do conservation work." And I was thinking, where have you been? Well, where's your head been? And it just drives me around the twist. There's so many people, angling clubs that are, well, I dread to think. I've been here, I've been in position up here for 6 years. I guess we've probably got £350,000 worth of funding, opened up 70 kilometres of river, planted the best part of 52,000 trees. Just kilometres of habitat improvement. And that's all the groups like yourself, and just me as one wild trout trust member. So it can be done.
Is there a criteria attached to the CEA funding then? Do you have to fulfil a certain...
There's various things on the form that yes, you have to fulfil, but it's easily achievable.
Right.
Easily achievable. They want to see, they're getting more and more. I've pushed the boundaries a lot recently because I've been working on quite small tributaries. My argument being that's where the youth is being forced to, really, and it's easier to work on those systems, but the benefits will drift downstream. But they're now wanting to see direct benefit for anglers. Well, we're an angling club with waters, some youth in the club, looking to create a legacy for the river. So tick 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 tick.
Okay, any other questions?
Just one, John, and this was mainly covered under the EA fund, but in my line of work, EA can be quite obstructive. But coming from you, in terms of flood risk, securing trees, things like that, are they quite receptive? Is an appetite to fund this work and to encourage enhancements?
So anybody who works with the EA, I mean, obviously they're getting battered right, left and centre in the press at the moment. But that's the EA in general, and it's mostly upper tier. The guys on the ground, there are still teams within the EA that have diametrically opposed views. So there's flood consenting and risk management are generally thinking about the river completely differently to fisheries, biodiversity and geomorphology. That's not to say that they don't work together, and I think, I'm hesitant to say it, but hoping that there is a groundswell of change towards working with natural processes. Certainly on the air, for example, because of the Leeds Flooding Alleviation Scheme, which I think you're quite heavily involved with, all the sort of hard engineering down in the cities is being offset with mitigation up in the headwaters, and we've tapped into lots of that. I mean, there has been the best part of £2 million available for the upper air catchment, which is just astounding amount of money. It's not enough, and it's not the right balance in my view, but 5 years ago it wasn't available, so we're working towards that.
The EA funding.
Yes.
I think it's 48,000 for the whole of Europe.
Yes.
Wearing my treasurer's hat, this club has no issue in being able to pay for this if we can't get EA funding. So let's not get down a rabbit hole on having to have EA funding. We demonstrated earlier we've got plenty of firepower if we choose to do it.
And the brilliant thing about it, a lot of the stuff isn't expensive.
No.
No, well, I was going to ask, Dover Gill, rough cost?
So I've probably spent about £4,000 there over 3 years.
And
Wait, that was 2.5.
This is not going to break the Bank of England or Barclays.
Well, you don't want us to use that as an excuse not to do it, do you? We
No,
don't
I don't think, I think with us, I think it's just taking that first step. It's a new direction. And I think it's encouraging to know that you can be with us and just get us going, and realise that it is within our competence.
Yeah. I think, just going back to your point there, I think there's a policy in place. I think we should be applying for that sort of thing.
I'm not saying we should.
And it definitely puts you on the map as with the EA.
I would want to, I would
Sure.
absolutely want to
Yeah.
apply,
Yeah.
but I wouldn't want to not do it if we didn't get
Perfect.
it.
Perfect.
Any other questions?
I'm very ignorant. I want to know why the single tree in the bank, you say they're the same sort and the same age. How's that come about?
Primarily because of the land use over time. It's that, the embankments would have been put there, and then they would have accumulated some soil, and it's that sloping face that has escaped grazing pressure over time. So a number of trees would have got away, or some of them might, on some of the embankments around some of the Dales rivers, they were deliberately planted to hold the embankments together. So, yeah.
When was that?
Whenever they were created, so ahead of 1848 in this case.
It's a good sign to modify a river.
Exactly.
Okay, any other questions? Johnny, I've been absolutely fascinated and encouraging, so thank you very much.
Okay.
Very much.